The water was red, the stadium frozen in disbelief. A woman's body broke the surface for an instant, her arm limp, her hair plastered to her face, before the orca's jaws dragged her down again into silence. Thousands of eyes stared, unable to breathe. The echoes of children's screams bouncing off the concrete as a husband reached out but grasped nothing but blood. That night ended not with applause, but with a single cry, swallowed by the depths, and no one could ever explain how trust collapsed so quickly. If moments like these make you feel the weight of what hides beneath the surface, stay with us and share this story so it's not forgotten. The California sun burned high over Oceanfront Marine Park in San Diego, turning the performance pool into a sheet of blue glass that threw bright shards of light onto the grandstands. The air smelled like salt water and sunscreen, with a faint undertone of thawed fish from the prep room. Loudspeakers pumped buoyant pop music across concrete and steel, the rhythm merging with the steady hum of the filtration pumps. Ethan Cole, 37, marine trainer and show lead, stood at the edge platform in a black wetsuit, still damp from the earlier set, his silver whistle clinking against his collar with each step. His palms were tacky with seawater and disinfectant. The deck's rubber matting felt slick under his boots, every foothold a decision. He lifted a hand to shade his eyes and scanned the crowd, families packed shoulder to shoulder. Phones lifted, kids in park-branded ponchos wriggling forward for the splash zone. Marissa Cole, 34, his wife and partner on this stage and every other, squeezed his arm through neoprene. "One clean run," she said, smiling. The easy confidence they'd earned across a decade together. Her braid was looped tight against her neck, a small habit that told Ethan she was focused. From the far end of the pool, a floor manager flashed a thumbs up. Cameras along the rail clicked to record. When Ethan raised his hand in the first signal, the crowd's chatter dropped an octave, a collective inhale before the leap. The water bulged, then burst open. Kaelen cleared the surface in a muscular arc, 6 tons of black and white power shearing skyward and falling back in a rain of cold mist. The crowd thundered. A child screamed with delight. The plume drifted across the deck and kissed Ethan's face. It smelled faintly metallic, the way seawater does when net pens have been scrubbed clean. In 2 beats, Kaelen slid to station along the glass wall, body hovering, pectoral fins drifting like open hands. Ethan signaled again, wrist crisp, elbow locked. Marissa mirrored him perfectly. Kaelen responded on cue, a high-speed pass, a deep dive, a clean breach, the landing slap echoing into the upper seats like a drum. Ethan angled his body to keep sunlight off his sightlines, tracking the orca's respiration. Blow, 2 seconds. Blow, 3 seconds. He cataloged it quietly, the habit of a professional who had learned that nothing on the water should ever be truly routine. Sound at -5, he told the deck tech over his shoulder, 2 fingers tracing down dial the music back enough to hear the whistles crisp. The tech nodded and slid the fader. Ethan planted his stance and threw the signal for the tandem lift. Marissa slipped into the pool, knifing the surface with toes pointed, the water swallowing sound around her like soft felt. Kaelen slid beneath, spine arching, and rose under Marissa's feet. For a beat, the orca carried her up on a living platform, water streaming like glass threads off Marissa's calves. The stands erupted again applause, the metallic rattle of seatbacks, the high chatter of kids calling out the animal's name. Ethan tracked Kaelen's eye as the orca leveled out and released. It was a habit taught by older trainers. The eye tells you what the fins won't. They reset on the far wall. "Look at that light," Marissa said, bobbing beside the platform. "The surface looks like mirror film." "Watch your footing on the exit," Ethan answered, raising 2 fingers for the spin cue, winds picking up. Kaelen pivoted, tail driving a clean spiral. Spray hit the first rows, and the smell of soaked cotton and alcohol sanitizer drifted up from the crowd. Ethan checked the clock on the scoreboard right on time. His chest settled, that familiar satisfaction of a sequence executing on rails. He let his gaze sweep the stadium blue acrylic wall panels, the oversized LED screen rolling sponsor logos, the lifeguard chair standing sentinel at lane 3, red rescue can clipped at its side like a punctuation mark none of them expected to need. He blew a short whistle and motioned Marissa into the glide. She dove again, cut a tight line, and surfaced with her palm raised. Kaelen ghosted beneath her, turning on a dime to take station for the next behavior. The water went oddly quiet in Ethan's ears, the way it does when you're listening too hard. He marked the rhythm again. Blow, blow, a slightly longer gap. He wasn't sure if he'd invented it. The audience, deaf to anything but spectacle, stamped and whistled. Pop music spun across the stadium at its safer, lower volume. The pump room's low thrum pressed against the back of his ribs. "Ready for tandem bow," Marissa called. Breath quick, but steady. She flashed him the small grin that had sold 1,000 brochures, the one that said this was more than a job. "Keep it tight," Ethan said. "If she hesitates, we reset." He signaled. Kaelen turned. For a second, everything was textbook: the glide up the glass, the roll, the cut back towards center. Then the circle tightened. Just half a body length, more narrow than it should have been. The tail beat a hair too hard. The surface braided itself into a darker blue, as if the light had shifted. Ethan felt it rather than saw it, the way a veteran feels a snag in a rope before it pulls. He moved 2 steps along the edge to widen his vantage and raised the flat palm signal that meant easy. Breathe. Good girl. Hold station words humans used for themselves, not for her. Kaelen slowed. Marissa floated 10 feet off the platform, treading a steady rhythm as cameras tracked her smile. The Orca's blow came louder this time, a wet exhale that bounced off the concrete a fraction sharper than before, somewhere under the seats. A baby cried, somewhere above. A gull called out, its note slicing the music like a thin knife. Ethan took the whistle between his teeth and felt the metal taste of it, salt and nickel, ready to cut the sequence if he had to. His right hand hovered at shoulder height, muscles tight without showing it. "Looks good," Marissa said softly, not looking away. "Stay with me." "Kaelen." The Orca rolled a fraction on her side, that dark oval eye now catching full light. Ethan watched it fix not on him but on Marissa, holding there longer than felt like coincidence. He knew the literature, the briefings. The file's eye contact in cetaceans is not the thing humans think it is. It is posture, attention, a point on a map of behavior. Still, the length of it made his throat dry. He clicked the reset cue under his breath, an old habit, a superstition, the way a pitcher crosses himself before a throw, even if he swears he's not religious. From the far deck, the floor manager flashed another thumbs up. The LED wall cut to a slow-motion replay of the earlier lift, water diamonds spinning off Marissa's feet. The crowd roared for themselves. Ethan swallowed and shifted his stance again. He told himself he was only noticing because he was trained to notice. He told himself 1,000 clean shows outweighed a single uneasy second. He told himself to follow the plan. He raised his arm for the next behavior and felt the band of the whistle press cold against the hollow of his throat. Marissa nodded once and extended her hand to cue the approach, fingers steady, face calm as the cameras found her again. The pump room hummed. The speakers thinned to an airy synth, the soundtrack everyone associated with triumph. A breeze carried the crisp smell of the Pacific into the stadium, cool against the heat trapped over the pool. Ethan's brain threw up a list he didn't want: tail slap intensity, respiration interval, circle radius, station hold. Kaelen hovered, the slightest sway running through her body like a wire carrying current. She didn't close the distance. She didn't leave. The eye stayed on Marissa, black glass under a sheet of sun. Ethan inhaled to blow the abort and found his lungs hitch on the first ounce of air. The crowd cheered again because cheering was what they had come to do. The wind nudged the flags above the scoreboard, and their fabrics snapped twice, sharp little cracks that sounded like warnings if you were listening for warnings. The deck beneath Ethan vibrated with a subtle, heavy beat as Kaelen flexed her tail against the pool's invisible currents. The smell of fish thickened, then slid away on the breeze, as if the air itself had tensed and released. "Easy," Ethan said, barely louder than a breath. He lowered his hand half an inch. Kalen's eye didn't blink. The whistle at Ethan's collar felt suddenly heavier, a small weight tugging at his chest as if reminding him of its purpose. Across 10 feet of glass blue water, Marissa held her position, palm lifted, the skin of her fingers wrinkled and pale from the hours they'd already spent in the pool. Somewhere up in the shade of the upper deck, A single camera light jumped from green to red. The music swelled. The Orca held her line, and the long, unbroken stare stayed pinned to Marissa, unreading, inescapable. The sun sagged lower over San Diego, its light turning the surface of Oceanfront Marine Park's pool into a polished mirror streaked with gold. The grandstands still pulsed with excitement, kids bouncing in their seats, their voices blending with the speakers that blasted triumphant music. Ethan Cole adjusted his footing on the damp platform, the rubber mat slick under his boots, while his heart matched the beat of the drums overhead. Beside him, Marissa's smile glowed, her braid clinging wet against her shoulder. She raised her hand high, and with perfect timing, Kaelen surged upward, lifting Ethan clean out of the water. Spray struck his chest, cold and metallic, stinging his eyes with salt. The crowd roared, some clapping in rhythm, others gasping at the sight of 6 tons of muscle moving at the trainer's command. Ethan dropped into the pool again, body slicing through the heavy blue. He surfaced near Marissa, catching the whistle between his teeth, but hesitating before blowing. He had felt it Kaelen's thrust a little harder than it should have been, her exhale sharper, louder, rattling against the concrete stands. Marissa brushed water from her face, flashing him a grin. "She's locked in today," she said, her voice just audible over the crowd. Ethan nodded, but the unease crawled deeper. Kaelen circled under the surface, her silhouette warping in the shifting light. She cut wide arcs, tail beats leaving tremors that rattled the platform under Marissa's feet. Ethan's hand twitched toward the abort cue, but Marissa lifted her palm to signal again. She believed in years of trust, in the bond they had built. She believed control was enough. Families in the stands cheered wildly, the scent of wet neoprene and chlorine drifting thick in the heat. Kaelen's head broke the surface, spray hissing from her blowhole. Her breaths came harder, longer. Ethan narrowed his eyes, every instinct urging caution. He lifted the whistle to his lips. But before he could blow, Marissa called Kaelen's name, her voice warm, coaxing. For a beat, nothing moved. The music swelled, trumpets rising over the stadium, but the pool was strangely still. Then Kaelen slid by without stopping, her body cutting shadows that stretched across the glass wall. The crowd stayed on their feet, clapping as if nothing had changed. But Ethan felt it a silence beneath the fanfare, heavier than the music, a warning carried in the water itself. Morning at Oceanfront Marine Park broke clear and bright, the Pacific air sharp with salt. The performance pool gleamed under a flawless sky, the glass walls glowing like blue ice as sunlight struck the surface. Ethan Cole tightened the strap of his whistle as he walked across the damp platform, the rubber slick beneath his boots from the early rinse. Marissa was already in the water, her strokes fluid, her braid darkened and heavy as it clung to her neck. Around them, stagehands checked sound equipment, cameras tested angles, and a few sponsors took their seats in the VIP rows. The smell of thawed herring drifted in from the prep room, strong enough to sting the nose, and the speakers crackled to life with the opening track. Kaelen surfaced once, her dorsal fin slicing through the water like a blade, then dove again, circling below. Her pace was slower, her arcs tighter. Ethan frowned, counting the breaths. 2, 3, 4. Longer than the day before. On the sideline, a young technician leaned toward him and whispered, "She's off today. Call it." "Ethan, don't push her." The words stuck in Ethan's chest, because he felt it too, that same knot of unease. But Marissa, radiant in her wetsuit, raised her hand and shook her head. "She's fine," she said firmly, her voice carrying across the platform. "She's warmed up. Let's finish clean. We owe them the show." Cameras were already pointed, red lights blinking. Ethan's gut twisted, but he blew the first whistle. Kaelen responded with sudden force, her thrust sending a wall of water into the first rows. Families screamed and laughed, drenched in spray, mistaking the raw power for spectacle. The vibration rattled through the platform, and Ethan felt it under his feet. Buckets of thawed fish slid on the slick concrete, the acrid smell hanging heavy in the air. Marissa steadied herself, lifting her palm for the next cue. That's when Kaelen lunged. Her jaws snapped shut just inches from Marissa's hand, the sound sharp, metallic, louder than the music. Gasps erupted from the stands, a wave of shock that silenced even the speakers. For a suspended moment, the entire stadium froze, soundless, but for the hiss of water rolling back from the impact. Marissa did not flinch. She steadied herself with both hands and forced a smile, her teeth tight, her body trembling just enough for Ethan to see. She turned it into performance, raising her arm as though it had been rehearsed. The crowd, hungry for illusion, clapped again, fooled by the mask she wore. But Ethan saw it all, the quiver in her fingers, the unease in her eyes. He blew his whistle hard, the shrill note slicing the silence. Kaelen did not retreat. Instead, the orca lifted her head just above the surface, her eye breaking the line of sunlight, fixed on Marissa with an intensity that stole Ethan's breath. The stare was unbroken, black and fathomless, a gaze that belonged to the deep ocean, not to a show. Ethan's skin prickled, the back of his neck damp with sweat despite the cool Pacific wind. He gripped the whistle harder, his lips dry. In that locked moment, he understood this was no mistake, no rehearsal quirk. The next time Kaelen struck, it would not be a warning. The sun slipped low over the Pacific, painting the horizon in streaks of crimson and gold. The ocean breeze carried the tang of salt and diesel from the harbor nearby, mixing with the sharper smell of chlorine that clung to the stadium's air. Ethan Cole sat on the weathered bench behind the performance tanks, his hands damp with sweat despite the cooling evening. He had asked for this meeting quietly, away from the noise of the crowd, still milling at the souvenir shops. Across from him sat David Rourke, a retired trainer whose career at Oceanfront Marine Park had ended abruptly years earlier. His voice trembled as he spoke, his gaze darting away from Ethan's. "She's not what you think she is," David muttered, his fingers nervously working the edge of a paper cup. "Kaelen has a history. 2 trainers before you, one ended up with broken ribs after she pinned him against the wall. Another was nearly drowned. They buried it, called them accidents. Do you know what they did next? Isolated her for months. No contact, no shows, and then just like that back on stage." He looked up finally, his eyes rimmed red. "She doesn't forget. You can't train that out of her." Ethan's chest tightened, the whistle at his neck suddenly heavy as lead. He wanted to dismiss it, to argue that Kaelen had been flawless with him and Marissa for years. But the memory of yesterday's lunge replayed, sharp and unyielding. The image of her eye dark, fixed, wouldn't leave him. "Why didn't you report it higher?" Ethan asked, his voice flat. "I did," David said, bitterness in his tone. "Reports were filed. Management stamped them as accidents. Accidents don't hurt ticket sales. Warnings don't sell t-shirts." His shoulders slumped as if the weight of years had finally broken him. "I left because I couldn't keep standing on that platform, waiting for her to decide the show was over." The words followed Ethan as he walked back toward the stadium. The smell of stale fish thick in the prep area, the cold fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Marissa was already there, smoothing down her wetsuit, her face calm, determined. She glanced at him with a smile, her braid resting against her back. "You're late," she teased. "We've got a crowd waiting." "Marissa," Ethan started, the words heavy. But her expression silenced him before he could go further. She had heard these warnings before countless times, and she had always met them with the same faith. Faith in discipline, faith in training, faith in Kaelen. "She's strong," she said firmly, pulling on her gloves, "but she knows us. We've built this trust for years. Don't let fear ruin that." Ethan said nothing. The sounds of the stadium swelled behind them, families taking their seats, children laughing, the chatter blending into a steady hum. The floodlights snapped on one by one, spilling harsh white beams across the pool. The water glistened like molten silver, every ripple distorted into jagged shadows on the acrylic walls. Kaelen broke the surface once, silently, then sank back down, her massive form sliding beneath like a ghost. Shadows twisted across the pool floor as she circled, her movements slow, deliberate. Cameras along the rail whirred, operators adjusting lenses, ready to capture another perfect miracle. Ethan's throat tightened as he stepped onto the platform beside Marissa. The night was cooling fast, the air heavy, his skin prickling under neoprene. He looked upward for a moment, past the blinding floodlights, toward the darkening sky. The first stars flickered faintly, watching, indifferent, like distant eyes. And Kaelen kept circling below. The stadium pulsed as if alive, the floodlights washing the pool in harsh white that shimmered across the glass walls. The smell of buttered popcorn, mingled with thawed fish and chlorine, carried on a breeze drifting in from the Pacific. Ethan Cole stood tense at the platform's edge, the whistle in his grip, slick with sweat. The crowd leaned forward in expectation, cameras raised, children bouncing in their seats. The speakers blared triumphant music, the bass line reverberating in Ethan's ribs. Marissa dove first, slicing into the pool with practiced grace. She surfaced in a smooth arc, her hand lifted to the lights as water streamed down her face. A heartbeat later, Kaelen exploded upward in a thunderous breach, 6 tons of muscle crashing through the surface. A blast of mist drenched the first rows as her tail struck the water like a cannon shot. Applause detonated across the stands, cheers echoing through steel rafters. For a moment, it was everything the brochures promised: beauty, power, trust. But Ethan felt it slip. Kaelen's circles beneath the surface tightened, her massive form cutting sharper turns than rehearsed. Each exhale hissed louder, ragged, a sound that bounced off concrete with unnatural force. Ethan raised his whistle, his gut twisted, but Marissa smiled for the crowd, her hand steady as she signaled again. She trusted discipline, trusted routine. The audience erupted, their voices masking the warning signs. Then, in a violent instant, the illusion broke. Kaelen surged from the depths, her jaws clamping around Marissa's arm with a crack that split the music. Water exploded upward in a white curtain, swallowing her scream. The crowd gasped as one, the applause collapsing into chaos. Ethan's chest seized. He dove without thought, the cold water burning his skin as he plunged. Below, the world was soundless violence. Blood streamed in dark ribbons, twisting through Kaelen's wake. Ethan struck at her flank with his fists, his lungs already aching, his mind screaming her name. Marissa's eyes locked on his through the blur, wide with disbelief, her mouth opening in a torrent of bubbles. He pulled at her free hand, muscles straining, but Kaelen's power was immovable. Above, the stadium erupted into horror, children crying, parents dragging them back from the rails, security shouting through megaphones. The speakers cut mid-note, leaving only the shriek of another trainer's whistle, shrill and frantic. But Kaelen did not yield. She twisted, dragging Marissa deeper, ignoring every command, every signal. The water smelled of iron and fear. Ethan's chest pounded with terror as his grip slipped. He surfaced once in a desperate gasp, the roar of the panicked crowd crashing over him, then dove again, teeth clenched, vision burning red. He struck, pulled, screamed her name into the abyss. But Kaelen's dark eye met his for a brief, chilling instant. It was not rage. It was decision. And in that moment, Ethan knew the predator had chosen. The pool was no longer a stage. It was a battlefield of water and blood. Ethan clawed downward, his lungs on fire, his fists striking through cold resistance as he reached for Marissa. She thrashed in Kaelen's grip, her arm twisted unnaturally, her face pale against the shadow of the predator. The Orca shook her with brutal precision, not frantic, but deliberate, as though every movement was measured. Ethan latched onto her hand, pulling with every shred of strength left in his body. But Kaelen's jaws clamped tighter, the vibration rumbling through the water like distant thunder. Then came the blow. Kaelen's tail slammed into Ethan's ribs, the impact rattling his spine, an explosion of pain that lit his vision with white fire. He tumbled, disoriented, bubbles spilling from his mouth as salt and blood filled his throat. The water pressed in from all sides, a crushing silence broken only by the thrash of muscle and the muffled scream that escaped Marissa's lungs for a heartbeat before Kaelen dragged her deeper, twisting her like a doll caught in a storm. Above the surface, the stadium had dissolved into hysteria. Radios crackled, security shouted, the shrill blasts of whistles pierced the night. But none of it mattered beneath the pool's surface. Safety lines slapped against the water. Divers in black gear plunged feet first, their tanks hissing as they tried to descend. Kaelen ignored them all. Her body moved with grim focus, circling, tightening, her eye fixed only on Marissa. Ethan surfaced, gasping, his chest searing, crimson foam swirling around him. Hands reached from the platform, but he shook them off, plunging again. His body screamed in protest, ribs aching, but desperation drowned the pain. He reached her waist, his fingers locking onto neoprene, only for Kaelen to wrench Marissa away. Her jaws locked around his wife's leg. Blood spiraled upward in a dark bloom, clouding the water until Ethan could barely see her face through the red. The stench of iron and salt filled his lungs as he gagged under the surface, choking. He kicked harder, blind, refusing to release. But Kaelen spun, her massive frame whipping in a slow, calculated roll. The orca's tail lashed again, a brutal strike that hurled Ethan upward. His body broke the surface, the scream tearing from his throat before he realized it was his own. Agony spread from his side, his wetsuit shredded, warm blood mixing with cold spray. Ropes splashed around him, strong hands gripping his arms, hauling him toward the platform. He struggled against them, his voice raw, screaming Marissa's name until it broke into sobs. On the deck, his leg collapsed beneath him, mangled and bleeding through torn neoprene. He barely felt it. His eyes were locked on the pool. Kaelen surged once more, her body breaching in a violent arc. Marissa hung limp in her jaws, hair streaming like seaweed, her arms outstretched as if reaching for air. For a moment, the stadium froze, thousands of eyes locked on the brutal display. The floodlights caught the spray, turning it into silver rain, a macabre crown around predator and prey. Then, with terrifying grace, Kaelen plunged again, vanishing into the depths with her captive. The roar of the crowd faltered into silence. Radios hissed, divers shouted into the void, whistles shrieked until throats were raw. But it was useless. Ethan's body trembled on the platform, his chest heaving, the pain in his ribs a steady drumbeat. He knew it in the marrow of his bones. This was no trick, no lapse in training. It was the truth they had all ignored. By dawn, the park no longer smelled of popcorn or sunscreen, but of wet concrete, chlorine, and grief. Oceanfront Marine Park was cordoned off with yellow tape, patrol cars flashing blue and red against the mist that rolled in from the Pacific. Floodlights from news vans cut harsh beams through the gray morning, slicing across the entrance arch with its cheerful dolphin logo now draped in silence. Camera crews hustled for position, their cables snaking across the wet asphalt, reporters rehearsing lines in low, urgent tones. Ethan Cole sat in a stiff hospital chair at Scripps Memorial, his body swaddled in bandages. His ribs ached with every breath, his leg burned from torn muscle, but none of it rivaled the hollow in his chest. His eyes stared at the linoleum floor, unblinking, as voices thundered outside the doors, questions he couldn't bear to hear. Did you see her go under? Did you try to save her? Who is to blame? His throat was raw, his voice gone. He hadn't spoken since they pulled him out of the water. On television screens across the nation, the story had already exploded. Headlines screamed in red banners, "Trainer killed in Orca attack." Clips replayed the seconds before chaos. Marissa smiling, Kaelen circling, then the feed cutting abruptly as screams replaced music. Talk shows debated risk and responsibility. Comment sections filled with rage and sympathy. Strangers turning her death into argument. Some blamed Marissa for stepping back into the pool, for trusting too much. Others pointed at the park, accusing them of hiding the animal's past. The accusations grew heavier when leaked memos surfaced, internal emails from executives dismissing incident reports, warning signs buried under the weight of ticket sales and sponsorships. She had shown signs before. One line read, stark and undeniable. The word spread like fire across social media. Anger rippled through the community. By mid-morning, protesters crowded outside the gates, their signs dripping with accusation. Blood on your hands. Nature is not a show. The chants carried through the empty stadium, echoing against glass and steel. Scientists spoke on national broadcasts, their voices calm, unwavering. Orcas do not forget. What happened was not madness. It was instinct. Years of confinement, pressure, and performance only sharpen it. Their words sank into millions of living rooms, reframing the tragedy not as an accident, but as a failure of illusion. For Ethan, the world shrank to one memory, Marissa's hand slipping from his grip under blood-stained water, her eyes widening as Kaelen pulled her away. He replayed it endlessly, the sound of the crowd collapsing into panic, the silence that followed. Every second etched itself deeper, burning into the edges of his mind until there was no escape. As daylight bled through the hospital blinds, a single question carved into him, hollowing him from within. It whispered in sync with the protests, the reporters, the scientists, and the country itself who had truly killed Marissa Cole. The weeks passed slowly, as though time itself resisted moving forward. Oceanfront Marine Park remained closed, its parking lots empty, rides silent, souvenir stands shuttered with steel grates. Where laughter and music once rolled across the grounds, only the call of gulls and the low hum of nearby traffic remained. At the heart of it all, the stadium stood hollow, its pool drained to a cracked basin of bare concrete. Under the pale winter sun, water stains streaked the walls in uneven bands, like scars left behind by years of performance. A single warning sign, sun-bleached and torn at the edges, dangled on the gate. Restricted area. The smell of chlorine clung stubbornly in the air, but beneath it lingered something else, faint, metallic, impossible to wash away. Ethan Cole returned once, leaning heavily on crutches. His leg was wrapped tight under layers of bandages, his ribs still aching with every shallow breath. The physical pain was nothing compared to the emptiness gnawing at him. Each step on the concrete echoed too loudly, bouncing back from the empty seats like reminders of the thousands who had once screamed in awe. He stopped at the railing, his hand pressing against the cold steel, and let the silence wash over him. The echoes came unbidden, the shrill whistles, the pounding of Kaelen's tail, the screams from the stands, the chaos that had erupted all at once. He heard it as if the stadium itself replayed the memory. His eyes stung, but he didn't look away. In his mind, Marissa surfaced again, her face pale under the floodlights, her hand reaching toward his as the water swallowed her. The final image that haunted him most was not the violence, but Kaelen's unblinking eye, black and calm, as if watching not just Marissa, but him too. Nearby, two trainers whispered, their voices carried softly in the open air. Reporters lingered at the gate, cameras idle, waiting for a statement he would never give. The world outside had begun to move on new stories, new headlines, another crisis to fill the evening news. But here, time had stopped. For Ethan, every ripple of that night still hung in the air, frozen. Above him, gulls wheeled in lazy circles, their cries sharp, hollow, carried on the wind that tasted of salt. Ethan whispered her name, so quiet that only the concrete seemed to hear it. He wanted to believe it traveled across the empty pool, settling into the silence like an offering. He turned away slowly, his crutches scraping the platform. Behind him, the drained pool glistened under thin sunlight, its silence heavier than the roar of any crowd. It was no longer a stage. It was a grave of spectacle, of trust betrayed, of illusions shattered. And in the hollow air, one truth carried louder than applause ever had: wild animals cannot be tamed. The afternoon sun had already slipped behind the stands, leaving the pool in a dim hush where even the gulls had stopped circling. The smell of salt and chlorine still clung to the railings, though the water itself was gone. A single towel, stiff with dried salt, lay abandoned on the concrete where the trainers once stood. Ethan's crutch tapped lightly against the platform as he paused, his shadow stretching long across the empty basin. He closed his eyes, and in that silence, he could still hear it, the shrill whistle, the crash of the tail, the sudden void when the crowd stopped breathing. Some truths don't fade, no matter how many times the water is drained. They live in the air, in the echoes, in the weight left behind. And as the wind carried the gulls' cries back over the stadium, one question seemed to hover in the stillness: do we ever truly hold power over what refuses to be tamed? If you felt that same chill, share this story, subscribe, and let it remind others of the fragile line we walk with nature.